Good afternoon or good evening, everyone. Thank you for being with us. Welcome to this segment of the Shaol and Louis Pozez Memorial Lectureship series in Judaic Studies. This is a series of longstanding, made possible by the generosity of the Pozez family here in Tucson. I'm David Graysboard, and I form part of the Arizona Center for Judaic Studies. It's a great pleasure to introduce tonight's guest speaker, Izabella Tabarovsky. She is joining us from Jerusalem, where it's very early in the morning. So first and foremost, I want to say thank you for going the proverbial extra mile to share knowledge and insight. Izabella Tabarovsky is an expert in Russian history, in the Holocaust, and in contemporary anti-Semitism, among other related political and historical subjects. She is a senior associate of the Kennan Institute. That's a think tank under the umbrella of the Wilson Center in Washington, D.C. And there, Ms. Tabarovsky oversees various research and outreach projects, including programming on historical memory. Tabarovsky's work has been published widely in scholarly venues, as well as in prestigious and popular journals such as Fathom, Tablet, The Forward, Newsweek, and the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. I really encourage you to look up the work. It's very accessible. And in that sense, it is a tribute to what it means to be a public intellectual. Recently, Tabarovsky has become a research fellow at the Institute for the Study of Global Anti-Semitism and Policy, a very interesting and very important center for the study of one of the subjects that will entertain us this evening. One of Tabarovsky's ongoing major research projects is a book on precisely the subject of tonight's lecture. That subject is the relationship between what I want to call hard left anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism, and the roots of that relationship in official and semi-official Soviet discourse. So our guest will speak for about 45 to 50 minutes. Afterward, for about 15 minutes, she will field your questions. That is, say, the attendees' questions. Please pose your questions through the Q&A function of this seminar room. And you can find the icon for the Q&A in the lower right-hand side of the menu bar of this Zoom window. So without more verbiage from me, let me welcome and hand the proscenium to Izabella Tabarovsky.
David, thank you so much. And it's a pleasure to be here. Thank you for having me, and welcome everyone. So I want to start us out with a look at two pictures. So let me shift to the slideshow mode. And I hope that everyone can see it. And I hope that you can't read Russian. If you can't read Russian, ignore the words. I want you to look just at the pictures. And I want to ask you a couple of questions about these pictures. First, are these pictures about Jews? And if you think that they are, how do you know it? You know,
sorry to interrupt, Izabella, but I don't think we can see the images right now. At least I can't. So you may want to try to share screen again.
Okay, all right, I'll do it again. I apologize. Let me see, let me get out of here. That would be, yeah, I think that I shifted to the pictures, but forgot to do screen share. So okay. Here we go.
Great, thank you.
Yeah, okay, I hope, okay, now I think you should see it. All right. Let me put it in slideshow mode, okay. Okay, so once again, the question is, as you look at these two pictures, are they about Jews? Do they portray Jews? And if so, how do you know it? And since we're in a webinar mode, I can't ask you directly, but I'm going to assume that it's not, these are not hard questions. I think that it's for anyone who's familiar with this genre of pictures and images, it's easy to understand what they're about. Even if you don't read Cyrillic, even if you don't read what it says. So first of all, we have the Star of David in both, right? And there is something about the portrayal of the spiders that makes one understand what they're showing. First of all, a spider is a very typical image of a Jew that's used in anti-Semitic literature and imagination, right? A spider presents a Jew both as a subhuman form of life and super powerful, because a spider weaves a web, right? And you can see in which it holds the world. And in fact, when I look at these pictures, I think that the web is kind of like the meridians and the parallels of the world. So these two spiders hold the world in their grip. The first image is dates to 1971. The second is 72. And so let's look at them again. And I want to ask you, if I told you that these, well, let me just add that, of course, there is also the kind of the very typically anti-Semitic portrayal of a Jewish face, right? The exaggerated Jewish features, right? You have kind of the caricatured big nose here, sinister smile. Now, if I told you that these pictures are about Zionism and Zionists, does that diminish this picture's anti-Semitic charge? And to me, it really doesn't. And here's what the words on this picture say. This here says Zionism. So this is not actually a Jew, you were mistaken. This is Zionism. And Zionism weaves a web, which consists of, and now I'm reading the words here, and the words are slander, lies, provocation, anti-communism, the Jewish question, which presumably Zionists constantly kind of inflame, and anti-communism. And again, it's a cartoon from 1971 that was published in Soviet Moldavia, and it's titled "The Zionist Cobweb at His Favorite Work," Cobweb Spider at His Favorite Work. The picture on the right is a photograph from a May Day demonstration of 1972 in Moscow. And what we're seeing, I believe that we're seeing a representation, a three-dimensional representation of this cartoon. This is a parade float, basically, and you see children catching a ride on this parade float. They're enjoying the first May sun. The sign here says Zionism is the weapon of imperialism. And then here you can kind of see also the ingredients of that Zionism thing. So anti-communism, militarism, and then there are others that I can't see. So again, the question is, what are people perceiving? Are they reading the words or are they looking at the image? What is more powerful here? Does the fact that this is supposedly a political cartoon diffuse its anti-Semitic charge? And to me, the answer is clear, and we can each have our own answers, but I'm going to stop sharing for a moment. And we're going to talk for a little bit, and then we'll look at some more pictures, and I hope that we'll have time for that. So why? So these pictures that we just saw were very typical of visual propaganda that existed in the USSR post Six-Day War, post 1967, and basically until the end of the Soviet Union. Okay, so the question is, why look to Soviet history and the experience of Soviet Jews in order to understand contemporary anti-Zionism in America? One reason is that there is an extraordinary and uncanny similarity between the xenophobic rhetoric that we hear today from certain corners of the hard left and the anti-Zionist language and idiom that was deployed and propagated by the USSR, both inside the country and also outside of it, again, primarily after 1967. There are slogans that are literally the same. Zionism is racism, Zionism equals Nazism, Zionism is a weapon of imperialism, Israel is a settler colonial state, Israel is a fascist state. Even the insistence that anti-Zionism and anti-Semitism are not the same, this idea was central to Soviet propaganda. Again, both domestic and foreign propaganda. Even as it multiplied the images that we just saw, it insisted that it was not anti-Semitic, it was simply anti-Zionist. Ideas, slogans, and entire narratives from that campaign appear in contemporary anti-Zionist left's discourse. And for ex-Soviet Jews like myself, and I was born and lived in the USSR until I was 19, their reappearance in contemporary American context is, first of all, a shock, and second, a massive red flag. Why? Because we know that this kind of talk and this kind of rhetoric and this kind of imagery got translated into anti-Semitic outcomes for Jews in the past. Because part of the reason that I am here in America and other former Soviet Jews are in America or in Israel is Soviet anti-Zionism. We know that there is nothing innocent about these slogans. In Lenin's and Stalin's USSR, Zionism was deadly for the Jews. In the 1960s, 70s, and 80s, anti-Zionist ideology led to the exclusion of the Jews from various professions, from various academic institutions, from positions that accorded public visibility, such as radio and television. I have stories of that, examples of that in my own family and in my own personal life. And every Jew was suspected of dual loyalties. So, and I want to say here that I think for those who have some memory of that history, perhaps, that the Soviet Union came down in history as a country of state-sponsored anti-Semitism. But today, from today's vantage point, it would be more accurate to call it a country of state-sponsored anti-Zionism. And we also know from that history and from our experience, we ex-Soviet Jews, we know that these ideas and slogans actually have nothing to do with actual Zionism, which they claim to oppose, nor do they have anything to do with the actual state of Israel. Soviet propaganda, anti-Zionist propaganda, was notoriously inaccurate whenever it tried to describe actual Israel. And there are actually funny stories when you read memoirs of some of the people who worked in the apparatus that produced this propaganda, of how at some point they do go to Israel and they see real Israel. And they're sort of shocked at how different it is from how they themselves imagined it, from how they described it. And you know, they ended up in this catch-22 of kind of becoming victims of their own propaganda. This form of anti-Zionism, I want to underscore it again, was developed as a propaganda tool to serve Soviet political objectives at home and abroad. It had nothing to do with justice for Palestinians or with reducing oppression. On the contrary, it led to the oppression of the Jews. These slogans and this rhetoric have been used in the past to demonize the Jews. They have been central to various forms of exclusion of the Jews. And we see these developments in America, and it brings back memories. And while the third and fourth generation American Jews are really barely paying attention, in my opinion, perhaps a little bit more today than even a year ago, those of us who have that experience, and certainly those of us who studied it like I have, we sort of see several steps ahead. We've seen this before, we know where it can lead. Contemporary debates about anti-Zionism versus anti-Semitism are very abstract, while the Soviet case offers a framework and a real-life, fact-based historical case study that allows us to investigate what really happens to the Jews, to real-life Jews, when politically weaponized anti-Zionism rules the day. And I think that is the key question. And that question cannot be answered in the abstract. And it should not be answered in the abstract because we actually have this historical case. And this case stretches from the Soviet Union to Eastern Europe. And it encompasses, it's a story of, I don't know, it's millions of Jews over generations, right? So it's a case that we cannot ignore. And we ignore it for Jews, they ignore it at their own peril. And for scholars, they remain willfully blind. They miss crucial aspects of evidence as they consider these issues. So I'll add that for politically weaponized anti-Zionism to have a negative influence on Jewish lives, it doesn't have to be state-sponsored the way it was in the USSR. The society can adopt norms on its own, particularly in the current environment when social media has such an outsized impact. And we'll talk about it in a moment. Finally, I'll add that the third and fourth generation American Jews understand right-wing anti-Semitism very well, right? I think that Americans today, the easiest and kind of the the one historical parallel they feel most confident making is one with World War II. Comparisons to Hitler, comparisons to Nazis are very easy for people to make, in part because this history becomes such a massive part of our popular culture, right? So many memoirs have been written, so many works of literature and fiction, historical fiction, and so many films have been made that it's an analogy that's very easy for people to make. Not so with this part of history, even though American Jews played a massive role, actually, in this history, right, during the campaign for Soviet Jewry. So we really need to understand this history in order to understand better our present and in order to find strategies to cope with some of the issues that we're seeing happening today around anti-Zionism. So let me give you some contemporary examples where I believe that, these examples are unfortunately numerous and they're multiplying. But I think it would help us to understand that already today in America, anti-Zionist rhetoric leads to, or is intended to lead to, or may lead to, if it's allowed, to negative outcomes for Jews, to exclusion of Jews, to demonization of Jews, and other anti-Semitic outcomes. So you may have heard about, a month ago, the DC chapter of the Sunrise Movement said that it would not participate in an upcoming rally due to the participation of a number of Zionist organizations. The Sunrise Movement defines itself as a youth movement to stop climate change and create millions of good jobs in the process. So it has, generally speaking, nothing to do with Israel, Jews, Zionism, but it made this statement. So here it is, attempting to exclude so-called Zionist organizations from an upcoming march inside DC, which has nothing to do with Jews or Zionists. What are these Zionist organizations? The Jewish Council on Public Affairs, the National Council of Jewish Women, and the Religious Action Center for Reform Judaism. So in essence, this group calls on participants in the rally to exclude mainstream Jewish groups because they claim they are Zionist. So you have an example of how the Zionist label is applied to a regular mainstream Jewish organization in an attempt to exclude it from a very mainstream political social action activity. Zionism for this group represents everything evil, everything dark, everything irredeemable about humanity. And so now they're applying this label to all Jews. I want to underscore that this group's notion of Zionism has nothing to do with actual Zionism. And its anti-Zionism is not really against real Zionism. It's anti-Zionism, just like Soviet anti-Zionism. I spell it without a hyphen because it represents an ideology of its own, right? An ideology that responds to its own fantasies and projections and its own conspiracy theories. So they can call themselves anti-Zionist all they want, but the result of their action would be anti-Semitic if it was allowed to proceed. Just recently, we had an example of the American activist Zara Bilou, the executive director of the San Francisco Bay Area branch of the Council on American Islamic Relations, who said in a recent speech to the American Muslims for Palestine annual conference that Jewish organizations such as the ADL, Jewish Federation, Zionist synagogues, and Hillel chapters on university campuses are not Muslim friends. And in fact, she went so far as to suggest that they're enemies. So again, we see an attack on mainstream American Jewish institutions under the guise of anti-Zionism. And I want to dwell a little bit on an article that was published recently in the Washington Examiner, and it was written by Melissa Brownstein. I recommend you look it up if you haven't seen it yet. It's an excellent, in-depth investigation based on numerous interviews, and it's called Publishing Against the People of the Book. So Melissa looked in this article at what is in essence an unstated boycott of Jewish writers who seek to explore Israel and Zionism in an open-minded way. So it describes numerous instances of Jewish writers being stonewalled by the mainstream publishing industry, where writers whose previous drafts and manuscripts have won prizes, all of a sudden cannot place their books anywhere. And they hear things like, I love this book, and if it were a different time, says an agent, but I don't think I can sell it because it's set in Israel. And I want to quote Yossi Klein Halevi, who is a good friend and a best-selling author. He's quoted in the article extensively, and he describes a growing sense of unease among younger Jewish writers dealing with explicitly Israel-related themes. They are feeling the industry closing up on them. Just being Zionist, says Yossi, is enough to get you stigmatized. And he notes that there is a mood. It's not like somebody said that this is how it is. There is a mood, he says, and moods are amorphous and are very difficult to resist because it's not coming from any one place. He says that he can't pinpoint what the source is, except broadly the obvious anti-Zionist tilt in growing parts of progressive discourse. It's not a policy, he continues, and many people in publishing might not even be aware of it, might not be aware that they're participating in an unofficial boycott, but that's increasingly the feeling and experience of young writers. It's much easier today to publish a scathing, one-dimensional take on Israel and Zionism than it is a nuanced, balanced, open-hearted attempt to relate to the conflict, and that's a tragedy. So what we're seeing is self-censorship around Jewish topics. Nobody's compelling anyone to do anything. People just sense the atmosphere and they're afraid, right? They're afraid to publish something that will get them attacked. They're afraid to be out of step with the times. They're afraid that it will somehow impact on their careers and their social lives and their social credit. And this is, I think perhaps this is so striking to me because look, if you talk to former Soviet Jewish scientists who experienced discrimination, they might say, look, I don't think the people on my dissertation committee were necessarily anti-Semitic, but they sensed the air and the atmosphere, and they were not going to promote any Jews, and therefore they failed. They failed me. All of this happening under the influence of anti-Zionist propaganda. This is how anti-Zionist rhetoric translates into outcomes for individual Jews. I lived in a country where Jewish voices were suppressed, and I find it incredibly distressing that this is now happening in America, right? So again, demonization of Zionism coming from a Soviet Jewish perspective, demonization of Zionism and Israel leads to demonization and exclusion of Jews. And this is already happening in this country. Okay. So, well, let me just add also that there is also an attempt that we're seeing to unravel the story of Jewish victimhood, most notably the story of the Holocaust. And there's obviously an attempt to show that Jews are oppressors. And we've seen several instances recently when public attempts to condemn anti-Semitism met with public outrage. So Rutgers condemned anti-Semitism last May in the midst of the Hamas-Israel confrontation, and then was forced to apologize and rewrite the statement. So there is simultaneously with an attack against American Jews, there is also an attack against, there's an attempt to leave American Jews without allies, because if American Jews allies are intimidated and are fearful of expressing outrage at anti-Semitism or condemning anti-Semitism, then Jews end up standing alone. Okay, so now let's go over a few examples from Soviet history where anti-Zionism was clearly anti-Semitic beyond any doubt. Now, I don't know the level of how well the audience understands Soviet history, but by necessity, I have to go through some of the things quickly, and perhaps if you have questions later on, we can discuss them, or I can direct you to further resources. So Soviet ideology was always hostile to Zionism from the beginning. Zionism was a nationalist ideology that went against Marxist-Leninist internationalism. And it was viewed, Lenin viewed it as an ideology that would split the Jewish proletariat. And this was very dangerous in Lenin's view, because from the Bolshevik perspective, Jewish masses were the most reliable supporter of the Bolshevik cause because they were so deeply oppressed in the Russian Empire. I think that it's fair to say, I'm pretty sure that Russian Jews in the Russian Empire were the most oppressed group of people. And so Lenin viewed them as allies. And he also, it's important to note, he didn't view Jews as a people because Jews did not have a common language and territory. This was the presumably Marxist reasoning, among some other things. And so the only Jewish path within the Soviet socialist society for Lenin was assimilation. So the Bolsheviks come in and they outlaw anti-Semitism, they outlaw pogroms because they view them, not because they necessarily love the Jews, but because they viewed the pogroms as a remnant of Tsarist reactionary ideology and a tool that the Tsarist regime used to keep poor Jews terrified and oppressed. They also remove all of the limitations and restrictions on movement and professions that existed at the time for the Jews. So it seems for a moment that anti-Semitism is in fact over, and everyone is uplifted in that sense of internationalism. It's actually people from that time, from the 1920s, will often remark on how truly extraordinary it was. Everybody felt like they were part of the big and happy Soviet family where all nationalities were equal. Everyone except for the oppressed groups, of course, the groups that the Bolsheviks were trying to exclude from the society. But in any case, anti-Semitism is temporarily over, but only for those Jews who are willing to toe a particular line. So if at that time you're a secular urban Jew, and you're excited to take advantage of all the opportunities that have opened up to Jews after the revolution, every profession is available, every school is available, you can live wherever you want, you're doing great. If you're a traditional and religiously observant Jew who wants to continue studying the Torah, who wants to keep going to the synagogue, who wants to be learning Hebrew, and if you are a Jew who believes in the establishment of a Jewish state in Palestine, in the 1920s, of course, are the years when these debates are particularly they're heating up, right? Then you're really out of luck. The 1920s saw massive anti-religious action in general, and Judaism was viewed as a particularly retrograde and backward religion and was attacked with particular zeal. And those years also saw the wiping out of all pre-revolutionary Zionists at the hands of other Jews, by the way, the so-called Yevsektia. Then come the 1930s, Stalin, the Great Terror strikes, and whatever positions Jews had gained, whatever gains they had, particularly if they had positions in the government or party leadership or the NKVD, where they were very visible, right? The NKVD is a precursor to the KGB, as well as the military. They're pushed out of them, and they're lucky if they're simply pushed out, because obviously this is great terror and people are murdered. And then the war comes, and I'm not going to dwell on the war because that's a separate story, but the war is when anti-Semitism in the Soviet Union begins to really pick up, including on the official level. This is the time when we see the birth of a sentiment that Jews had set out the war in Tashkent in Central Asia, that they evacuated, that they didn't fight, they simply fled, which is completely untrue. 500,000 Jews fought in the Red Army. This is a time also when Stalin forms the Jewish Anti-Fascist Committee, which consists of prominent Soviet Jewish cultural figures, and it's headed by the celebrity Jewish actor Solomon Michols. So Stalin sends Michols and his colleague poet Itzik Pfeffer to America and elsewhere around the world to raise funds for the Red Army, which they do. They have a great tour of America. They meet American intellectuals, including Jewish intellectuals. They meet Einstein. They raise a ton of money. They completely woo American Jewry. They raise a ton of money. They pay for this success with their lives. Michols is murdered on Stalin's orders in January of 1948. A ruthless cosmopolitans campaign begins. Who are ruthless cosmopolitans? They are Jews infected with the bourgeois nationalist virus. In other words, they're Zionist Jews. The fact that these Jews had traveled to America or had relationships with Americans, had formed relationships with American intellectuals, American Jews, now goes against them. So other members of the Jewish Anti-Fascist Committee are also arrested, tortured, accused of being part of an anti-Soviet Zionist plot, falsely accused, of course. They're murdered in August of 1952 in what is now known as the Night of the Murdered Poets, which I feel compelled to note that I always find it to be a misnomer because not all of them were poets. There were actors, there were intellectuals, there were doctors, but they're murdered in August of 1952 secretly. And if you want to learn more about it, in popular culture right now, we have Dara Horn's excellent podcast, Adventures with Dead Jews. Look for the episode titled The Disposable Jews. Or read Joshua Rubinstein's excellent book, Stalin's Secret Pogrom, which contains the transcripts of the interrogations of the members of the Jewish Anti-Fascist Committee. Okay, so in 1952, also there is a show trial against 14 Czech communists in Prague, the so-called Slansky trial. Almost all are Jewish. They're accused of being a part of a Zionist plot and executed in December of 52. Similar things, less murderous, but accusations of Zionism also just happened throughout Eastern Europe. And I have to note, this is shortly after the Holocaust, right? The Soviet Union is murdering Jews. It's murdering Jews who are anti-fascist. It's murdering Jews who are communists. So this is why, because it accuses them of being Zionists. Okay, so this is interesting. All right. So this is where perhaps around here, murderous anti-Zionism ends, right? It ends with the death of Stalin, essentially. But anti-Zionism, of course, doesn't end. And the next big spurt of anti-Zionism in the Soviet Union, and it continues, it never stops, but the big spurt, a really big spurt, occurs after the Six-Day War and Israel's victory in it. The big spurt occurs because now the Soviet Union has a need, a policy need, right? It has policy interests. It needs to respond to the shock of Israeli victory, which changes the balance of powers in the Middle East, which it believes America played a role in it, and it needs to act, and to act in ways that include propaganda. And so they develop a whole new set of anti-Zionist propaganda ideas, which also acquire a massive international scale of a kind that it didn't have before. So hundreds of books and thousands of articles are published to advance Soviet political objectives in the Middle East and at home, propagating vicious demonization of Zionism and Israel. Books are published under the titles such as Caution Zionism, Fascism Under the Blue Star, The Class Essence of Zionism, Dezionization. These books are published in massive print runs, literally millions of copies. They're translated in dozens of languages. They're shipped abroad. They're turned into brochures, easily digestible brochures, and they target foreign audiences. They target foreign Western hard left parties. They target intelligentsia, the academia, anybody who they can bring to their side, right? To bring the world's public opinion to their side becomes a target for this propaganda. And these are deeply anti-Semitic books that borrow from the protocols of the elders of Zion and even Hitler's propaganda. This is when the slogans that are so familiar today and false narratives that are so familiar today begin to appear, that Zionism is racism, that Zionists are fascists, that Zionists collaborated with the Nazis during the war, that Zionists act toward Palestinians the way Nazis acted toward the Jews. And here's what's interesting. The people who wrote these books, and there were about a dozen of them or so, a dozen key authors, were actually not Marxist-Leninist in their outlook. The 1950s and 1960s saw the emergence of a new strand of thought in the USSR that was grounded in deeply conservative, often far-right nationalist, Russian nationalist thinking that was also deeply anti-Semitic. They believed, many of them believed that the Soviet Union was on a wrong track. They believed that it needed to return, some believed that it needed to return to pre-revolutionary kind of Russian empire. And those who believed that were in fact viewed as dissidents, and they were apprehended and sent to the camps. But there were others who learned to couch their ideas in Marxist-Leninist terms. And they acquire massive influence within the party apparatus, including both communist and the Komsomol, which was the youth communist apparatus. Some of them were so-called Arabists who worked at or were close to the Middle East Department of the Soviet Ministry of Foreign Affairs. And this group comes to be known as Zionologists. They become to supply the party apparatus, the propaganda apparatus, with ideas that they pick up in anti-Semitic literature, which they read and which they agree with, but couching it in Marxist-Leninist rhetoric. And it helps, this rhetoric helps the Soviet Union address its propaganda needs with regards to Israel and the Middle East and what it views as the Zionist challenge. And so as part of this reframing, whatever anti-Semitic literature, when anti-Semitic literature talks about a Jewish conspiracy, they talk about Zionist conspiracy. Where classic anti-Semitic literature talks about Jews owning the banks and the politicians in the West and corrupting the world, they talk about Zionists doing the same. Where classic anti-Semitism talks about Jewish corrupting influence, I think I already mentioned it, they talk about Zionist corrupting influence. And where classic anti-Semitism believes that Jews view themselves as the chosen people and therefore superior to other nations, they talk about Zionists doing the same. And this, by the way, serves as the foundation to the idea that Zionists are racist. It's a deeply reactionary idea that takes root in classic anti-Semitic literature. And for me, it's incredibly shocking to see it repeated by today's idealistic, hard left, progressive young people on American university campuses. So just as we saw in the pictures that we started with, nobody, of course, was fooled in the Soviet Union. Everyone understood that when they said Zionists, they really meant the Jews, even when they didn't want to mean the Jews, because in fact, within the party apparatus, there were those who felt appalled at this propaganda, who still believed that there is no room for this kind of discourse in the USSR. Still, even when it was not intentional, let's assume that the Soviets were actually sincere when they said that they were targeting Zionists and not the Jews. But ordinary people understood it as meaning the Jews, and this is how it was taken. So I want to now to look at a few more pictures, and I'm going to do a share screen, and tell me if you can't see it. Let's see. I think here we are. All right. Okay, so this is first of all, what you see on the left. I'm going to show these pictures in comparative perspective, just to show you some continuities. So what you see on the left is a poster from a contemporary demonstration somewhere, typical, right? We see this everywhere. What you see on the right is the cover from Mahmoud Abbas's book, which was based on his dissertation, which he defended in the Soviet Union. And stories about his dissertation and his book have sort of misinterpreted what he was really trying to say there. You can't read the dissertation, but you can read the abstract. I've read the abstract. The dissertation is classified in Russia. I think our Western reports have focused on the fact that Abbas was kind of questioning Jewish victimhood in the Holocaust. But really the point of his writing is the comparison between Nazism and Zionism, and the parallel between Nazism and Zionism, which again was a Soviet idea, which he picked up, I'm sure, picked up in the institution where he defended his dissertation, which was one of the central hubs of the production of Soviet anti-Zionist propaganda. All right, let's look at this pair of pictures. On the left, you have a cartoon that appeared in Pravda Vostoka, a Soviet regional newspaper, in December of '71. You see the melding of the swastika with the Star of David. And here's a similar melding in a contemporary cartoon that appeared on the progressive blog Daily Cause. And this kind of melding of the swastika and Star of David is fairly common in hard left spaces. Okay, let's look at these two pictures. So the picture on the left appeared in Sovetskaya Moldavia, which is the same newspaper that published the picture that we saw at the beginning with the Zionist spider. Here, it's one of those rare instances when the Soviets slipped a little bit, and which shows you that when it came to this propaganda, some of it was decided at the top, but there was discretion regionally, right? And every editor, a lot of times, ended up making his own decisions or her own decisions. And in this case, what was the mistake that the editor made? The mistake that the editor made was to forget to indicate that this is about Zionists. What do we see in this picture? This picture is called In His Image and Likeness. And you see a picture of a Jew. It's obvious, right, from the stereotypical Jewish features, including the horn, right? The classic anti-Semitic idea that Jews have a horn. The Jew is holding an axe that's dripping with blood. We know that he's a Jew. Obviously, you have the Star of David here. There is nothing here at all, right? Not even Israeli army uniform to indicate that this might be a Zionist. This is simply a Jew. And you see the reflection of this Jew in his shadow, right? This Jew becomes Hitler. So this is one of those instances, again, and it happens with today's hard left as well, here and there. They will slip and they will forget that they're supposed to be talking about Zionists, and they end up talking about Jews, like we just discussed, right, with the Jewish organizations. This editor forgot to make that distinction. And he forgot it because this distinction is so fine. That line between anti-Zionism and anti-Semitism is so fine that it's almost as to be virtually non-existent. Here on the right, we have a picture that was submitted to Iran's Holocaust cartoon contest in 2016. You see the same concept. a Jew looking in the mirror and seeing Hitler. Okay, let's look at this. And I want to check how much time I have. Just a second. Okay, we have a few minutes. Should be enough. All right, so on the left, you have a picture, a cartoon from August of 1967 that appeared in Sovietskaya Rossiya, Soviet Russia. This is a really interesting image. It's very detailed. So what you see is an Israeli soldier who is standing guard next to a sign which says life space, Lebensraum, essentially, right? It's a Nazi idea, right? And justification for conquest. So the idea here is this this Zionist soldier or Israeli soldier has borrowed from the Nazi concept of Lebensraum. He's holding what looks like a weapon, and on the weapon it says Blitzkrieg. So again, a Nazi, a reference to the Nazis. Next to him is a ghost, a Nazi ghost, who is giving him a blueprint of Auschwitz. And here it says the new order, model Auschwitz, of the Auschwitz model. And of course, in the back, you have people up against a wall. What's interesting about this picture is that it appeals to everything that the Soviet Union would have known as the greatest evil on earth, right? This is just 20 years after World War II, the greatest, just incredible catastrophe for the Soviet Union, great victory, but also incredible catastrophe, right? Massive losses, millions lost. I mean, the memory is still fresh. And the propaganda is appealing to that memory. Why is it using these concepts? Because it makes it easy to communicate the idea that Israelis and Zionists are the most evil people in the world, right? So this obviously has carried over into the contemporary moment. On the right, you see a cartoon that won first prize in Iran's Holocaust cartoon contest in 2005. It was posted on a progressive blog, Daily Cause, in 2006 and remained there through at least 2010. So you see references to Auschwitz. So it's the same idea. Okay, and I think this will be the last cartoon that we'll look at, or the last set of cartoons. So the one on the left, you see an Israeli soldier. It's a Soviet cartoon from 1972. An Israeli soldier dreaming of Hitler. And look at how this Hitler inside the Star of David almost looks really cute, right? Kind of sweet and cute little Hitler, while the Israeli soldier is looking kind of intimidating, right? There's blood dripping from his weapon. There is the picture of devastation behind him. And the cartoon is titled, "We Learned Our Lessons from World War II." This is, of course, a recurring theme in contemporary anti-Zionist propaganda. The Jews failed to learn their lesson from the Holocaust, and they have now become the oppressors, as if Holocaust was some kind of an elaborate advanced university degree that Jews were supposed to obtain. Okay, then the picture next to it, you see a picture, it's as if it's a museum in which the Nazi is portrayed in a painting, framed in a painting. And so he's unreal, just like the Hitler on the left, right? But the Israeli right under him, and you see it's a parallel posture. And on the helmet, you see the Star of David, and here you see the swastika. Total parallel portrayal, except that the Israeli is real and the Nazi is not real. And so the Israeli is the scarier one today. And the picture is called, it appeared in the Evening Moscow popular newspaper in 1971, and it's called "The Talent and Its Admirers." And on the right, you have a cartoon by Carlos Latouf, very much esteemed on the hard left, posted on Indie Media in 2009. I believe it's still there. And here you see obvious references to World War II, an Israeli tank, which has the Nazi, leaves a Nazi print, a Palestinian girl wearing striped Auschwitz uniform, right? Israelis dressed as fascists, as Nazi Germans, etc. So the parallel is clear. Okay, so we'll end here and I'll stop sharing. And so I'll just run through a few conclusions and then we'll go to questions. So what I'd like to say is that for Soviet Jews, the anti-Zionism of the Soviet state was clearly and undeniably anti-Semitic. Soviet Zionism, whose echoes we're hearing today, was an ideology that was developed specifically as a propaganda tool to serve Soviet Cold War foreign policy interests, its interest in the Middle East, and also its domestic policy interests. And unfortunately, I don't have time to go through those, but I think it's pretty interesting to understand what were the policy interests. We can discuss it separately. Inside the country, it was developed, this anti-Zionist propaganda was used to suppress the national Jewish movement and the Soviet Jews movement for Jewish identity and emigration. And I posit here that you can't borrow or deploy or use Soviet anti-Zionist language without also borrowing and deploying Soviet anti-Semitic attitudes, the anti-Semitic attitudes that are baked into that language. They're inherent in it. They're inherent in the concepts, in the ideology of those who produced it. And so, politically weaponized anti-Zionism acts by demonizing everything connected to the word Zionism and Israel. And once an associative link is established between Israel and Zionism and Nazis, it becomes extraordinarily easy to demonize the Jews. And Soviet Jewish experience shows that politically weaponized anti-Zionism will always end up harming Jews. It is already happening today in America in left of center spaces. I have seen this before. I kind of know how the story ends. And American Jews really need to understand it. They need to understand that ultimately they will be the target. In some ways, they are already the target. And they need to figure out what to do about it. And I think that the first step to doing it is to understand the sources of this ideology, to learn the history behind it, and to learn how it impacted real Jews in real life historically. So I'll end here. And David, back to you.
Thank you very much, Izabella Tabarovsky. You've given us much to think about. I'm going to segue now into the Q&A. I've received one question from an attendee, and she asks, "Hi, thank you so much for this extremely informative lecture. This year, almost 100 American rabbinical and cantorial students signed a letter that was pro-Palestine / anti-Zionist. That is 17% of the students from the non-Orthodox institutions in the US. How do you think this far-left American Jewish leadership will affect the future of Judaism, both here in the US and globally?"
Well, look, I think it's particularly distressing to see Jews fall for these ideas, I would say. And I would also argue that I actually disagree that this stance is pro-Palestinian. I don't think that it serves Palestinian interests. I think it serves the interests of some of the Palestinian leadership, including the truly extremist elements of the Palestinian leadership. And it's really unfortunate. I don't think that it serves the interests of the people. I do think that I can't help thinking that it will affect the future negatively, which is why it's really important that we find ways to counter these ideas, to show that there is nothing remotely social justice about them. There is nothing remotely true about them, that this is propaganda that unfortunately Jews also fall for, just like many other intelligent people who are left of center.
Thank you. Another question from an attendee. He poses the following query. Do you think the anti-Semitism from the left is worse than from the right?
You know, I want to look, first of all, we do this, but I sort of disagree with the very premise of this idea. I don't think that we should necessarily be comparing anti-Semitism from the left and the right. To me, first of all, it's all on a spectrum. As I mentioned, the Soviet anti-Zionism was ostensibly leftist, but its sources had very deep right-wing ideas in them. And today's far right also uses anti-Zionist language, the kind of anti-Zionist language that also exists on the left. So I think we need to look at it as a whole, first of all, because otherwise those who fight anti-Semitism end up being divided. Instead of uniting, we sit and argue about, well, which anti-Semitism is worse. I do think that anti-Semitism on the left is a lot more insidious. I think what's dangerous about it is that it exists in the spaces where most American Jews live and work, and because we are much less, American Jews are far less aware or trained to understand it, how to counter this kind of anti-Semitism. I think that makes it particularly dangerous. That's my take on it.
In the absence of another question, let me sort of arrogate the privilege that I have here and ask one of my own. It sounds to me as though one of the implications of your presentation is that it is absolutely necessary to acquaint oneself with Soviet history. Obviously, that's an ideal. Many people don't have time to devote to re-educating themselves, or if they're very young, to acquiring any kind of knowledge. Where would you start? Is there a particular work that you would recommend, or a particular author? Or how would you go about building a sort of a fundamental knowledge of, let's say, Soviet nationalities policy, campaigns against ruthless cosmopolitans, campaigns against Zionism, and so forth?
Wow, that's a good question. And you're, of course, completely right that, that it's hard to get people to learn any kind of history at all. Look, I mean, I hate to draw attention back to myself, but I have a couple of articles where I do go over this history briefly, and I think that you might just read them and that will give you an idea. So one is in Fathom, and it's called Anti-Zionism and Contemporary Left Antisemitism. And the other is in Tablet, where I go over the cartoons and I include some of that history. So that's one place. I mean, look, listen to Dara Horn's podcast, listen to that episode, the Disposable Jews. You know, follow people who generally, I would say, shed light on left-wing anti-Semitism. One of these people is David Hirsch, who doesn't necessarily write a lot about Soviet anti-Zionism, but he writes about hard left anti-Zionism and anti-Semitism. And I think that you get kind of some of the reference points. As far as, I think that part of the reason I'm having trouble pinpointing a particularly good book on the subject is that a lot of the books on the subject were written during the Cold War. And I think that they were not really, I think that for a contemporary reader, they are not necessarily, they're either too scholarly or they may seem too irrelevant today. Mm-hmm. But, you know, I will think of something. I will think of a book perhaps that I could recommend, and maybe we can email it to the participants.
Great, that would be very good. Another attendee asks, I hear that 90% of American Jews are Zionists, I hope, but on Twitter, it seems like 50-50. Is the 90% number accurate?
Well, that's a good question. That's the statistic that we get from research, right? From opinion polls. So I want to believe that it's accurate. I think that the latest poll results have shown it to be a little bit less. I think it's maybe in the 80s. Yeah, Twitter, look, Twitter is a unique environment, right? Twitter attracts people who are particularly conscious and want to sort of politically conscious and want to express their opinions. So it's a little bit different. I do think that I do believe that most American Jews have some Zionist sentiments, whatever you mean by that, by the way. I think that itself needs to be identified and defined. But I don't know what will happen with the young generation, because I think that purely academically and scholarly, you know, when we look at that, I think that the next generation is where the battle will happen, because the young generation, some are able to resist, but most, unfortunately, don't have enough of a background and understanding to resist what they encounter on campuses. And I think that this is an issue that goes actually as deep as Jewish identity. How do you develop a Jewish identity that is strong enough to resist the kind of onslaughts that today's young people encounter on campus?
Mm-hmm. Okay, thank you. Another attendee writes, could you discuss these anti-Zionist cartoon contests? Presumably he or she is requesting some kind of background on what these are, what their outcomes were, and so forth.
Well, the only contest that I believe I mentioned was the Holocaust cartoon contest that was held by Iran. This is Iran did that, I think, maybe 3 times or something like that. I don't know much beyond the fact that, yeah, all kinds of people participated and we're seeing the outcomes. I don't know of anybody else holding this kind of contests, thankfully.
Okay, I have another question, and that is whether you believe that that radical Jews provide something of an alibi for the association of anti-Zionism and anti-Semitism, or is this merely an alibi for those who wish to propagate those ideologies? What I'm asking, I suppose, is whether radical Jews, in essence, are or might be convincing neutrals of the somehow the validity of the hallucinatory claims, like genocide and ethnic cleansing and all these slogan-driven things. Yeah,
I think yes, absolutely. And again, there is a rich history to it because, for example, when the Bolsheviks wanted to get rid of Zionists in the 1920s, they engaged the Jews in doing that. Why? Because they understood that if they did it themselves, they would be accused of anti-Semitism. So they got Jews to get rid of their own. In the 70s and 80s, the KGB actively deployed prominent Jewish intellectuals in the USSR to speak on behalf of the anti-Zionist ideology, because they believed that when Jews speak to others and also to other Jews, they convince the Jews and they also convince others, and they preclude accusations of anti-Semitism. So I do think, look, I mean, we're all entitled to our opinions, right? And the radical Jews are entitled to their opinions, but for sure they influence the Jews, and for sure they're used by those who want to be propagating these claims.
Okay, thank you. Another attendee asks, where are we now in terms of Russian government approaches to Israel and to Jews? What is the Russian government's approach toward Palestinians?
Well, look, today, Russia doesn't have state-sponsored anti-Semitism. In fact, Putin is viewed, in Israel at least, as, very generally speaking, favorably. He is viewed, certainly when Bibi was in power, he had a very good relationship with Bibi. I mean, I view it very skeptically because look, I can imagine that it's true, as they say, that Putin has, very warm feelings toward Jews because he had some important Jewish figures in his life. But there are also particular reasons why Jewish support and Israeli support is important for Putin. And that's because the Israeli story and the Jewish story in World War II, which is central to Russian propaganda today and to Russian kind of identity, the Russian identity building project, the Jewish story sort of can confirm what's so important for Putin to communicate, which is that the Red Army liberated the camps and saved the Jews and ended the Holocaust. And because so many Jews fought in the Red Army and so many of them then ended up in Israel, Israelis easily concede. It's no problem for them to say, yes, of course, the Red Army was better than the Wehrmacht, right? And so in that way, that's a kind of support that Putin can rarely find anywhere else around the world today. There is evidence that Russia never acts kind of with one voice, right? That's what we see at the top. But there's also evidence that Russian security kind of intelligence services are also deploying and supporting the far right in Europe, the European far right that is, of course, obviously deeply anti-Semitic. I've also seen that Russia's state television offers platform to radical, hard left anti-Zionists from Britain in particular, and also to our own American Max Blumenthal. So it's complex, but there isn't sort of a state propaganda or a state-driven anti-Semitism or anti-Zionism emanating from Russia today as it did in Soviet times.
Okay, very well. We are unfortunately out of time, so I want to thank you once again for this very enlightening talk. I want to also tell all the attendees, number one, that we will send information, contact information for Ms. Tabarovsky so that you can pose questions to her separately. I also want to happily point out, despite the grimness of the subject, that we have invited Ms. Tabarovsky to join us again for a talk under the rubric of the Duchin Campus Lecture Series. This will be a less, let's say, formal interview, and you will have, in other words, added opportunities to ask questions and to engage in a freer and more thorough exchange. So again, thank you very much to all the attendees. Really, without your interest and support, Judaic Studies would not be what it is here at Arizona. Thank you, Izabella Tabarovsky. We will be sending information not only about Ms. Tabarovsky's future talk, also via Zoom, but a colleague and I are planning a small half-day conference on anti-Zionism and anti-Semitism in the context of social discourse in academia. So stay tuned for that information. I wish to also thank, very importantly, Jackie Schmidt, who made all the logistical arrangements, handled all the publicity, including late messages to everyone, and Martha Castleberry, who works behind the scenes to handle all the financial details. So I apologize also to the last questioner whose query we didn't have time to cover, but of course, this is a query that can be posed separately via email. Okay.
So and David, thank you.
Yes.
I want to thank you so much. And I want to thank Jacqueline. It's been a pleasure to work with you and to speak. And I look forward to being back.
Absolutely. We definitely look forward to that. So thank you all very much. Have a wonderful night or morning, regardless, depending on where you are. Okay.
Thank you. Bye-bye. Bye.